They say you should trust your instincts, that little voice in your head that tells you when something's wrong. I ignored mine, and now I don't know how much time I have left. It started when I moved into this old house. I was desperate for a place of my own, something cheap and quiet, where I could write my book. The place had been on the market for years, and I was surprised it hadn't been snatched up sooner. Sure, it was a little run down, but it had charm. Exposed beams, creaky wooden floors, that kind of thing. Perfect for me, or so I thought. The first night, I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. At first, I assumed it was mice. I've lived in old houses before, and it's never anything more than a few pests. But this was different. The scratching wasn't random. It followed a pattern, almost like something was moving with intent. I tried to ignore it. That first week, I threw myself into my writing, staying up late into the night, drowning out the sound with music and coffee. But the scratching didn't stop. It got louder, more persistent. One night, as I sat at my desk trying to focus, the scratching was so loud I could feel it vibrating through the walls. I slammed my hands on the desk, frustrated. "Enough!" I yelled, knowing full well there was no one to hear me. But to my shock, the scratching stopped. For a moment, there was silence. I stood there, frozen, listening to the oppressive quiet of the house. Then I heard something else, a voice, whispering my name. I know what you're thinking. I was exhausted. My imagination was running wild. But I swear, it was real. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It came from within the walls. I backed away from the desk, my heart pounding in my chest. I searched the room, my eyes darting to every corner, but of course, there was no one there. The voice stopped as suddenly as it had started, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispering, soft, insistent, like a distant chant. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it was calling me. The next morning, I decided to check the walls. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but I needed to know. I started with the living room, tapping the walls, listening for anything unusual. Nothing. Then I moved to the bedroom. When I knocked on the wall behind my bed, the sound echoed. Hollow. There was something behind the wall. Grabbing a hammer, I pried away the wooden paneling. The boards came loose with a groan, revealing a small, dark space behind the wall. My heart was racing now. Adrenaline is surging through me. I reached it inside, feeling around, expecting to find an old pipe, or maybe a nest of some sort. What I found was worse. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. I pulled it out and stared at it in disbelief. It was a door handle, rusted, ancient, but unmistakably a handle. My pulse quickened as I felt around for more. And soon, I uncovered the outline of a small door embedded in the wall. I yanked the door open, revealing a narrow passageway that disappeared into darkness. A foul, musty smell wafted out, making me gag. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the black void, my mind racing with questions. Who had built this? Where did it lead? Before I could stop myself, I grabbed a flashlight and crawled inside. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. The air was thick, suffocating, and the deeper I went, the more the walls seemed to close in around me. I was shaking now, fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened up into a small room. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The room was empty, save for a single object in the center, a large, ornate mirror. I approached it slowly, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I aimed it at the glass. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, but something was wrong. My reflection wasn't moving. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest, but the figure in the mirror remained still, watching me. Then, slowly, its lips curled into a smile. I screamed and turned to run, but the passageway behind me had vanished. The walls were solid. I was trapped. The thing in the mirror reached out, its hand pressing against the glass. I watched in horror as the glass began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. The hand pushed through, followed by an arm, and then its head. I backed away, my mind screaming for a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The figure stepped out of the mirror, standing before me. It looked like me, but its eyes were wrong, black and empty, like a void that threatened to swallow me whole. It smiled again and whispered, "It's your turn." I've never been superstitious. Ghosts, demons, all that stuff. Just stories people tell to scare each other, right? At least, that's what I believed. But after what I experienced, I'm not so sure anymore. It all started when I moved into the old farmhouse on the edge of town. I needed a place to stay after my divorce, and the rent was dirt cheap. The landlord said the house had been empty for years, and I could see why. It was ancient, with creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, and an attic that no one had bothered to clean out. The first few nights were uneventful, though the house had a way of making you feel like you weren't alone. I figured it was just my imagination. After all, I was living in a creaky old house. Strange noises were to be expected. But then, one night, I heard something strange coming from the attic. It was late, probably around 2 a.m. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic thumping. I lay there for a moment, listening. At first, I thought it might be an animal. Squirrels or raccoons sometimes got into old houses. But as I listened, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't random. It was as if someone, or something, was pacing back and forth in the attic. I got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was nothing. Just an animal, or maybe the wind. I climbed the stairs to the attic, my footsteps echoing through the house. The attic door creaked as I opened it, and the thumping stopped. The silence was so sudden, it made my skin crawl. I shone the flashlight into the attic, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just old furniture, covered in dust, and a few cardboard boxes piled in the corner. I stood there for a moment, listening to the heavy silence. Nothing moved, no sounds, no thumping. I shook my head, feeling a bit foolish, and turned to go back downstairs. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me." I froze. My skin prickled with fear. The voice was soft, almost pleading, and it seemed to be coming from the far corner of the attic. "Help me." I shone the flashlight toward the corner, my heart racing. There was nothing there. Just an old rocking chair, swaying gently back and forth. I hadn't noticed it before. The chair looked ancient, its wood worn and cracked with age. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me." I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of that attic, to leave the house and never come back. But I couldn't move. It was as if the voice had rooted me to the spot. Slowly, I approached the chair. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the back of the chair. It was cold, ice cold. Suddenly, the chair stopped rocking. The whispering ceased, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on me like a weight. And then I felt it. A hand, cold and bony, grasped my wrist. I screamed and yanked my arm away, stumbling backward. The chair began to rock violently, as if an invisible force was sitting in it, thrashing back and forth. The whispering returned, louder now, desperate. "Help me, please." I turned and bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was outside, standing in the freezing night air. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with what I had just seen, what I had just felt. I didn't go back inside that night. I couldn't. I slept in my car, too afraid to go anywhere near the house. The next day, I went back up to the attic, convinced that I had imagined the whole thing. But when I opened the door, the rocking chair was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there in the first place. I moved out of the house a week later. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that voice, soft, pleading. "Help me."